Okay, we're back. Narcissism who? I don't know her. Okay. Okay, so this is why I don't think I can film this video after all this, because I really need to take notes first. These is how I write my sentences. Colonialism and capitalism have codependently evolved to control the binarized network of power relationships that undergird the Western world. Maybe I'll just read it slowly and then it'll work. So expropriation is a key feature of both ideological superstructures, not Marx's superstructure. It allows for theft of resources under the justification of the common good, which is constantly adapting to achieve legitimacy in new contexts and historical periods. So some examples would be liberal democracy being the vector of freedom. That's constantly like evolving and adapting idea. Free trade as economic advancement that is continually re-articulated in like new fashion to respond to every failure in the neoliberal system because it absorbs crises. And colonization as a Christianizing mission, you know, like just stuff that's like wrapped in these benevolent terms to guise them. So anyways, as a colonially and capitalistically founded country, Canada must constantly legitimize its fabricated sovereignty over Indigenous lands in order to reap the economic benefits of their natural resources. Consequently, it must scramble to neutralize Indigenous sovereignty assertions, for they are not merely barriers to foreign investment interests, but existential threats to the Canadian state itself. These assertions share some characteristics in form and reception, but are also place-specific due to the different sourcing of crown title across the country. So, for example, in cases of development opposition, nations in Ontario, or like just the eastern provinces, might refer to historical treaty agreements. So, like in the Grassy Narrows, First Nation versus Ontario in 2016, that case, or while nations in British Columbia, on the other hand, where there are no historical treaty agreements on the mainland, draw their rights and title from an absence of treaties, like in the Chilcotin versus British Columbia 2014 case. So, one such recent case is the opposition of a number of Coast Salish nations to the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. Trans Mountain was purchased by the federal government for $4.5 billion in May of 2018 and has since undergone a series of rejections and reapprovals on the basis of this Indigenous and environmentalist opposition. So those supporting or opposing the project draw upon divergent definitions of Indigenous title and consent. This work gets interesting. Many refer to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP henceforth. So many people refer to this to explain the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, which is notably referenced in Article 32 and also translates as a guiding principle of the document or the declaration as a whole. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion dispute has featured subjective manipulations of UNDRIP, Article 32, mobilized by Canadian political actors and investors to support paternalistic narratives around Indigenous peoples on issues of resource development. Very quickly, before I state my thesis, on the note of paternalism, I was thinking today, because I watched Fahrenheit 11/9 last night with my roommates, which is the Michael Moore documentary, not on Bush, but on Trump. And am I the only one who, this is very odd, but I feel like these world leaders are like kind of like my fathers. They're like father figures to me. Is that weird? Is that like really weird, or is that something that like a lot of people feel? I'm sure it's because it's such a paternalistic and patriarchal system. And what's that called when the filial piety? Is that what it's called when you're supposed to be you're like look to the state as your father and like be loyal to them in the same way? Is it filial piety? I think. Anyways, I feel that like I kind of feel like Trump is my dad, and I kind of feel like Trudeau is my dad, or not like my dad. I just feel like they're my fathers. And I might not include that because that's really weird and I would like to explore it more. Anyways, so my thesis for this whole essay. So just kidding, that was my thesis. But to substantiate this proposal, we will explore the nature of land title in BC, broadly accepted definitions of FPIC, and how these conceptions are manipulated and narrowed by state and industry officials. So, moving on to Crown sovereignty legitimization in BC. Due to the unevenness of the colonization process across Canada, as I mentioned earlier, and the differences between Ontario and British Columbia, it is important to historically situate BC in its interactions with Indigenous title. So the settlement process in BC began with the arrival of Matthew Bailey Begbie, who, enabled by the doctrine of discovery, which is just when like any Christians can come to territory that's inhabited by non-Christians and then declare it Christian territory and therefore own it. So he was empowered by the doctrine of discovery and pointed to Fort Langley from his boat to announce the colony. And then presenting as a beacon of resource development since its inception, the colony attracted an influx of miners whom Begbie allowed to settle on Indigenous lands without consent. So there was no consent even from the beginning. When this forceful invasion was met with forceful defense in return on the part of the First Nations, he found an opportune excuse to carry out violent retribution against the Indigenous defenders. Although reserves were initially created, not through treaties, land was just set aside, they were little more than symbolic attempts at legitimizing invasion, because borders that are malleable only to one party delineate confinements rather than reserves. The imperial authorities did not bother with treaties in BC like they had in the East, save for the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island, and it was effectively founded as an apartheid state. Consent or mutual agreement have evidently never been features of the settlement process in BC, which can accurately be described as a process of expropriation. Indigenous peoples only hold title to 0.36% of BC today. 0.36% from 100. So, although coming into the 21st century, BC and Canada have adopted reconciliation rhetoric in response to the Indigenous uprisings of the 1970s and evolving international human rights standards, like I mentioned in UNDRIP, they strategically focus on celebrating Indigenous peoples as equal members of the multicultural national fabric. Multicultural, not multinational. That's very important. The inherent insufficiency of this appraisal of legal equality over equality in fact is evident in the continuing disparity between Indigenous and settler life options, and is upheld by perfunctory consultation processes that ignore the foundational requirement of consent on stolen lands. So the BC Treaty Commission was formed following the Kanesatake standoff of 1990, or the Oka Crisis, in response to fears over a similar Western uprising, and aimed to resolve the issue of unextinguished Indigenous land title through modern treaty agreements. Sorry, my roommate said something. While Canadian political officials claim that these modern treaties embody the principle of FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent, the Crown's administration of extinguishment terms and participation funds reveals an underlying perpetuation of asymmetrical power relations. So basically, in these modern treaty agreements, in order to basically have their land title and self-governance recognized in limited forms, these Indigenous nations have to come to the table and put all their rights on the table. So then the government decides which ones they want to give back, and they call it self-determination. even though it's very limited. And also the whole process is very long, understandably, because they're treaties. But, hello?
Sam and cat right here.
What?
It's 5.
Was that our time?
Yeah.
Oh my
I
god,
know.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Crazy. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you, by the way.
Cool. Thank you. I know. That's why I wanted to film a video. So I was like,
All right, we'll keep doing you. Or nope, don't anymore.
okay. So I have a bunch of friends here now. I have to go. I'm just gonna finish this sentence. So the BC Treaty Commission to be continued.